Alright, the next thing I need to work on are the legs for the chair. And I'd like to select a primitive that isn't chunky like a box. I like it to be a little bit more elegant. And for that, I'll go back to the standard primitives and I'll select a cone. And I'm choosing this because the cone allows you to have a different radius at the top as compared to the bottom. You'll see what I mean. So I'll just draw in a cone very roughly here, and I'll drag it up so that it penetrates through the seat. Go to Modify and adjust the parameters. Now, I'd like the bottom of the leg to be more slender than the top. Radius 2 controls the top, and radius 1 the bottom. Maybe I'll make radius 2 a little bit more chunky. And then I'll drag the height spinner down so that the leg is sunk into the seat itself. It doesn't really matter if that primitive is sticking through the seat. But it is important that the primitive is not so low as to be below the seat. Let's move it over. And perhaps we'd get a better view of this if we were to arc rotate. I'll hold down the Alt key and drag the mouse wheel. And now I can see that we need a little bit more adjustment here. I'll drag that up. And watch as the bounding box disappears into the seat. That's a good indication that you've penetrated into that object. Now I'll also drag in the XY plane and move that leg over right there into the flat region of the seat. I'd say that looks good. I'll go up here and name this leg 01. It's always a good idea to name your objects, and I always leave 01 on the end of my original object. That way, if I ever clone the object, the clone will be called leg 02. This leg might look better if it had a foot. Perhaps I'll use a sphere for that. That's easy. I'll just make a sphere over here. There's an option called base to pivot, and watch what that does. It moves the sphere up so that its geometrical base is located at the pivot point, which rests on the home grid. If this is unchecked, then the pivot point is still on the home grid, but the geometry is symmetrically arranged around that pivot point. So in this situation, it makes sense to check base to pivot so that the bottom of the foot rests on the ground. I'll move that over, and I'm not going to ever get it centered if I just drag it like that and try to eyeball it. A better way is to use Quick Align. I'll press Shift A and then click on the leg, and we're immediately aligned so that the pivot points of the objects coincide. I'll make that smaller. And for such a small object, we don't need as many segments. We can save some memory by decreasing that a bit. Because at that scale, however, when we're looking at the chair, we're not going to notice that it's a little bit chunky. Now I'll select the object and press Z, Zoom Extents All Selected. Then I'll arc rotate around that selection because I have arc rotate selected down here, chosen. And that shows me that we have a potential problem here, and that is that the leg is sticking through the foot. I'll select that leg and move it up a little bit, somewhere in the middle of that sphere. And while I'm at it, let's squish the sphere down a little bit. I'll use Scale and just drag that Z handle down to give it a little bit of emphasis that there's some weight to the foot. That looks good, but that may have had repercussions on where the leg meets the seat. because we did move it up after all. It looks okay, but I'll just decrease that height a little bit until I see the bounding box right there. And then I'll go back up slightly, and we know that we're very close to being intersecting perfectly. Okay, so I'll get that foot and I'll give it a name. And now we want 4 feet symmetrically arrayed around the origin point. We can do that in a couple of ways. Perhaps the easiest way is to change the transform center to use transform coordinate center, and that moves it to the origin point. Now I can use the mirror tool to flip that leg over in the y-axis. I'll make an instance and click OK. Then I'll select both legs and both feet and do that again, but this time I'll use the x-axis and instance them again, and now we have all 4 legs.